The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Whitmore Palace as Queen Camilla descended the grand staircase. Her emerald green dress rustled with each calculated step, but beneath her composed exterior, a storm was brewing. For weeks, she had endured the whispers, the sideways glances from courtiers, and the barely concealed disdain from certain members of the royal household who still considered her an outsider despite her decade as queen. King Charles stood in the blue drawing room, reviewing documents for the day's state meetings. His silver hair caught the light streaming through the tall windows as he adjusted his reading glasses. He had noticed Camilla's increasing tension over the past days, but had attributed it to the usual pressures of royal duties. What he didn't know was that his wife had just received news that would shatter the careful facade she had maintained for so long. Lady Margaret Pemberton, the palace's senior lady-in-waiting, and a woman who had served the previous queen with unwavering loyalty, had been overheard making particularly cutting remarks about Camilla's suitability for the throne. The words, reported to Camilla by a sympathetic young aide, were not merely critical, but cruelly personal, touching on matters that Camilla had thought were buried in the past. The confrontation began innocuously enough. Camilla had requested Lady Pemberton's presence in a morning room, intending to address the situation with the dignity befitting her station. The room, with its pale yellow walls adorned with portraits of previous queens, seemed to mock her as she waited. When Lady Pemberton arrived, her expression was one of barely concealed superiority, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized her sharp features. "Your Majesty requested my presence," Lady Pemberton said, her curtsy so slight it bordered on insulting. Camilla's hands tightened on the arms of her chair. "Indeed I did. It has come to my attention that you have been expressing certain opinions about my position within this household." Lady Pemberton's thin lips curved into what might have been a smile. "I'm sure I don't know what your Majesty means. I have always conducted myself with the utmost propriety." The word propriety hung in the air like a challenge. Camilla felt the familiar heat rising in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced countless times when forced to smile through veiled insults and subtle slights. But today was different. Today, the dam that had held back years of frustration began to crack. "Propriety?" Camilla's voice rose slightly. "Is it propriety to question my marriage to the king in the servants' hall? Is it propriety to suggest that I am nothing more than a placeholder for a ghost?" Lady Pemberton's composure faltered for just a moment, surprise flickering across her face. She had not expected the queen to confront her so directly. "Your Majesty, I think perhaps there has been some misunderstanding." "There has been no misunderstanding." Camilla stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished floor. "For 10 years, I have endured your condescension, your barely hidden contempt, your constant comparisons to a woman who has been dead for decades." The mention of the late queen caused Lady Pemberton to draw herself up to her full height. Her late Majesty was beloved by the nation. She understood what it meant to be queen, to put duty before personal desires. Some of us remember what true royalty looks like. Those words were the spark that ignited the powder keg. Camilla's carefully maintained control shattered like fine crystal hitting stone. "How dare you?" she shouted, her voice echoing off the ornate ceiling. "How dare you stand there and lecture me about duty? I have given everything to this role, sacrificed my peace, my privacy, my very self to serve this nation." The commotion had not gone unnoticed. In the hallway outside, 2 royal guards, Sergeant James Mitchell and Corporal David Fraser, exchanged worried glances. They had been stationed outside the morning room as part of the regular security rotation, but the raised voices from within were unprecedented. The queen was known for her composure. To hear her shouting was alarming. Inside the room, Camilla's tirade continued, years of pent-up emotion pouring out in a torrent. "You think I don't know what people say about me? You think I don't hear the whispers, see the comparisons in every newspaper, every social media post? She's not as beautiful. She's not as charming. She's not as perfect as the sainted princess." Lady Pemberton attempted to interject, but Camilla was beyond stopping. She swept her arm across a nearby table, sending a priceless porcelain tea set crashing to the floor. The sound of shattering china was like an alarm bell to the guards outside. "Should we?" Corporal Fraser began, but Sergeant Mitchell was already moving toward the door. King Charles, in his study 2 rooms away, heard the crash and looked up from his papers. His private secretary, Sir Edmund Hartley, paused mid-sentence in his briefing about the upcoming state visit from the President of France. "What was that?" Charles asked, frowning. Before Sir Edmund could respond, they heard Camilla's voice, louder now, carrying through the palace corridors. Charles rose from his desk, concern creasing his brow. He had never heard his wife lose control like this. Back in the morning room, Camilla had moved past the point of rational discourse. Her face was flushed, tears streaming down her cheeks as she advanced on Lady Pemberton, who was backing away with genuine alarm in her eyes. "You want to know what it's like to be constantly measured against a ghost?" Camilla's voice cracked with emotion. "To know that no matter what I do, how hard I try, I will always be the woman who broke up the fairy tale. I have spent every day of the last decade trying to prove myself worthy of a crown that sits heavy on my head, and still, it's never enough for people like you." Lady Pemberton had reached the wall, her escape route blocked by overturned furniture. For the first time in her decades of service, she looked genuinely frightened. The Queen's emotional state had escalated beyond anything she had anticipated. It was at this moment that Sergeant Mitchell made the decision to intervene. Royal protocol dictated that guards should never enter a private meeting uninvited, but the situation had clearly spiraled out of control. He knocked firmly on the door before pushing it open. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "Is everything all right?" Camilla whirled around, her tear-stained face a mask of fury and pain. "Get out," she screamed. "This is a private matter." But Sergeant Mitchell stood his ground, his training taking over. Behind him, Corporal Fraser appeared, and within moments, 2 more guards had arrived, drawn by the commotion. They formed a subtle but effective barrier between the Queen and Lady Pemberton. King Charles arrived at precisely this moment, Sir Edmund trailing anxiously behind him. The king stopped in the doorway, his expression one of complete shock as he took in the scene. His wife, disheveled and crying, surrounded by royal guards. Lady Pemberton pressed against the wall, looking terrified. Broken porcelain scattered across the floor, and overturned furniture suggesting a physical altercation. "Camilla." Charles's voice was barely above a whisper. "My dear, what on earth?" The sight of her husband seemed to break through Camilla's rage. She turned to him, and suddenly all the fight went out of her. Her shoulders sagged, and she would have fallen if Sergeant Mitchell hadn't stepped forward to steady her. "I can't do this anymore, Charles," she sobbed. "I can't keep pretending that their hatred doesn't hurt me. I can't keep smiling while they tear me apart piece by piece." Charles moved forward, his shock giving way to concern. He had never seen his wife, usually so composed and regal, in such a state. The guards parted to let him through, and he gathered Camilla into his arms. "Take Lady Pemberton to the Rose sitting room," he instructed Corporal Fraser quietly. "Ensure she's comfortable, but I think it best she remain there until we can sort this out." Lady Pemberton, still visibly shaken, allowed herself to be escorted from the room. As she passed, she caught Charles's eye, and in that look was a mixture of defiance and fear. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but Charles's stern expression silenced her. With the immediate crisis defused, Charles turned his attention back to his wife. Camilla was trembling in his arms, her emotional outburst having drained her completely. The remaining guards stood awkwardly, uncertain whether to leave or stay. "Thank you for your intervention," Charles addressed Sergeant Mitchell. "Your quick thinking prevented, well, I'm not entirely sure what, but I'm grateful nonetheless. Please ensure no one enters this wing of the palace until further notice, and discretion would be appreciated." "Of course, Your Majesty," Mitchell replied with a bow. He signaled to the other guards, and they filed out, closing the door behind them. Alone with his wife, Charles guided Camilla to a settee that had escaped the destruction. She collapsed onto it, her face buried in her hands. Charles sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, waiting for her to speak. "You must think me mad," Camilla finally whispered, her voice hoarse from shouting. "I think you're human," Charles replied gently. "And I think I've been blind to how much you've been suffering." Camilla looked up at him, her makeup smeared, her carefully styled hair in disarray. In that moment, she looked not like a queen, but like a vulnerable woman who had reached her breaking point. "She said I was a placeholder for a ghost," Camilla said, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "And the worst part is, sometimes I wonder if she's right. How can I compete with a memory? Charles? How can I ever be enough when I'm constantly compared to someone who's been elevated to sainthood?" Charles pulled her closer, his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He had thought Camilla had made peace with the comparisons, had found her place as queen. To realize she had been suffering in silence all these years was a painful revelation. "You are not competing with anyone," he said firmly. "You are my wife, my queen, my partner in all things. What others think or say, we cannot control that. But I know your worth, Camilla. I see how hard you work, how much you care, how gracefully you've handled impossible situations." "Gracefully?" Camilla let out a bitter laugh, gesturing at the destroyed room. "Look at what I've done. The guards had to intervene like I was some common brawler. The scandal. There will be no scandal," Charles said decisively. "This stays within these walls. As for Lady Pemberton, her time in royal service has come to an end. I should have addressed her attitude long ago." Camilla shook her head. "That won't solve anything. There will always be another Lady Pemberton, another reminder that I'm not her, that I'll never be her." Charles was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" he finally asked. "I see a woman of incredible strength who has weathered storms that would have broken most people. I see someone who has brought warmth and humanity to an institution that can be cold and unforgiving. I see the woman I love, who makes me laugh, who understands me in ways no one else ever has." "But the people see what the media shows them," Charles interrupted. "They don't see the countless hours you spend on your charities, the difference you make in individual lives, the dignity with which you've carried yourself through unprecedented scrutiny." "But I see it, Camilla. I see all of it." They sat in silence for several minutes, the only sound Camilla's gradually steadying breathing. The morning sun had shifted, casting new patterns across the debris-strewn floor. It seemed symbolic somehow, the broken pieces catching the light, beautiful even in their destruction. "What happens now?" Camilla asked eventually. "Now," Charles said, helping her to her feet, "we go to our private apartments. You rest. I deal with Lady Pemberton and ensure the staff understands that what happened here was a private matter that will remain so. And then, my dear, we talk. Really talk. About how we move forward, how we ensure you never feel so alone in this role again." As they walked toward the door, Camilla paused, looking back at the destruction she had wrought. "I'm sorry about the tea set. It was Sèvres, wasn't it? 18th century." A small smile tugged at Charles's lips. "17th, actually, but porcelain can be replaced. Your well-being cannot." They emerged from the morning room to find the corridor empty save for Sergeant Mitchell, who stood at attention. Charles nodded to him gratefully. "Sergeant, I trust one can rely on your discretion regarding this morning's events?" "Absolutely, Your Majesty. As far as I'm concerned, I was merely checking on an unusual noise that turned out to be nothing of concern." "Good man," Charles said. "Please convey my thanks to the other guards as well. Their professional handling of a delicate situation is noted and appreciated." As the royal couple made their way through the palace, servants and staff members quickly averted their eyes, sensing that something significant had occurred. The story would spread, as palace stories always did, but it would be in whispers and speculation rather than fact. In their private apartment, Charles helped Camilla to their bedroom. She sank onto the bed, exhausted by her emotional outburst. Charles sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "I meant what I said," he told her. "Things are going to change. I've allowed certain attitudes to persist in this household for too long, out of misguided respect for tradition. But tradition should never come at the cost of your happiness or dignity." Camilla squeezed his hand. "I don't want to be the queen who caused upheaval in the palace. "You won't be," Charles assured her. "You'll be the queen who brought necessary change, who modernized an institution that has been stuck in the past for too long. And I'll be right beside you every step of the way." As Camilla lay back against the pillows, closing her eyes, Charles remained beside her, holding her hand. His mind was already working through the changes that needed to be made, the conversations that needed to be had. Lady Pemberton would be pinching off quietly, but immediately. The household staff would be reminded that their loyalty was to the current crown, not to memories of the past. And, perhaps most importantly, he would ensure that Camilla had more allies within the palace walls, people who appreciated her for who she was rather than constantly comparing her to who she wasn't. The morning's events had been shocking, unprecedented even, but perhaps Charles thought they had also been necessary. Sometimes it took a moment of complete breakdown to reveal the cracks in the foundation, the problems that had been papered over for too long. And now that those cracks were visible, they could finally begin the work of truly healing them. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its light through the windows of Whitmore Palace, a new chapter was beginning. It would not be without its challenges, but for the first time in years, there was hope that Camilla might finally find her place not just as queen, but as herself. The afternoon following the morning room incident found Whitmore Palace in an unusual state of hushed activity. Servants moved through the corridors with extra care, their footsteps muffled on the thick carpets, their conversations reduced to essential exchanges. Word had spread, as it always did in the palace, that something unprecedented had occurred, though the exact details remained shrouded in speculation and rumor. In the Rose sitting room, Lady Margaret Pemberton sat rigid in a silk-upholstered chair, her hands folded precisely in her lap. She had been waiting for nearly 3 hours, during which time she had been offered tea, declined, lunch refused, and the company of various junior staff members, dismissed with a look that could freeze water. Her gray hair, which had come slightly undone during the morning's confrontation, had been meticulously restored to its severe bun. Only the slight tremor in her hands betrayed her inner turmoil. She had served the royal household for 43 years, beginning as a young woman during the reign of the previous king. She had witnessed scandals, triumphs, tragedies, and transformations, always maintaining her position through a combination of competence, connections, and an unwavering dedication to what she considered the proper order of things. Never in all those years had she imagined it would end like this. The door opened, and Sir Edmund Hartley entered, his expression carefully neutral. Lady Pemberton straightened even further, if such a thing were possible. "Sir Edmund," she began, her voice carrying its usual tone of authority, "I trust this misunderstanding can be resolved quickly. I have duties to attend to." Sir Edmund took a seat across from her, his manner formal but not unkind. "Lady Pemberton, I'm afraid the situation is rather more serious than a simple misunderstanding. His Majesty has asked me to inform you that your services to the royal household are no longer required." The words hung in the air like a physical blow. Lady Pemberton's carefully maintained composure cracked, just for a moment, before she rallied. "After 43 years of exemplary service, I'm to be dismissed because the Queen had a tantrum?" Her voice was ice-cold, but there was something else underneath. Hurt, perhaps, or disbelief. "The circumstances of this morning were regrettable," Sir Edmund said carefully. "However, His Majesty feels that the relationship between yourself and Her Majesty has become untenable. A generous pension has been arranged, along with a grace and favor apartment in Hampton, should you wish it. Your personal effects will be packed and sent to wherever you direct." Lady Pemberton stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is a mistake. The household needs people who understand tradition, who remember what the monarchy stands for. Without us, standards slip, protocols are forgotten, the very fabric of the institution begins to unravel." "The institution," Sir Edmund replied quietly, "must also evolve to survive. His Majesty believes that evolution is overdue." Meanwhile, in the palace medical wing, Dr. Sarah Pembroke was concluding her examination of Queen Camilla. The Queen had initially resisted Charles's suggestion of a medical check. insisting she was merely tired, but had eventually acquiesced when he pointed out that the morning's events suggested she might be under more stress than she realized. "Your blood pressure is elevated," Dr. Pembroke said, removing the cuff from Camilla's arm. "Not dangerously so, but enough to be concerning. Have you been sleeping well?" Camilla gave a rueful smile. "Define well. I sleep, but the dreams—" She trailed off, then shook her head. "I'm being ridiculous. Millions of people deal with far worse than unkind words and sideways glances." Dr. Pembroke, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying temples, sat down beside the Queen. "Your Majesty, emotional stress is just as valid as physical stress. The pressure you're under is immense and unrelenting. What happened this morning? What happened this morning was a loss of control that cannot happen again," Camilla interrupted firmly. "I've embarrassed Charles, frightened the staff, and created heaven knows what kind of security incident. What happened this morning," Dr. Pembroke continued gently, "was a human being reaching a breaking point. I've been the palace physician for 15 years, Your Majesty. I've seen what this life can do to people. The late Queen herself once told me that there were days when she wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all." Camilla looked at her in surprise. The late Queen was always held up as the epitome of royal perfection, unflappable and eternally gracious. "She did. She was human too," Dr. Pembroke said. "The difference was that she had 50 years to build up her defenses, to surround herself with people who supported her unconditionally. You've had to build those same defenses while under constant scrutiny and, if I may be frank, while dealing with people who seem determined to undermine you at every turn." A knock at the door interrupted them. Charles entered, his face creased with worry. "How is she, doctor?" "Stressed, exhausted, but fundamentally healthy," Dr. Pembroke replied. "I'm prescribing rest and a significant reduction in duties for at least a week. I'd also recommend—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I'd recommend considering speaking with someone. Dr. Rebecca Marshall is excellent with high-profile clients who need absolute discretion." "A therapist?" Camilla's voice was sharp. "The press would have a field day. Mad Queen Camilla seeks psychiatric help." "The press need never know," Charles said firmly. "Your health, mental and physical, is more important than their opinions." After Dr. Pembroke left, Charles sat on the edge of the examination table beside his wife. "I've spoken with Edmund. Lady Pemberton will be gone by evening." "Charles, no, Camilla protestive. That's exactly what they'll use against me. The vindictive queen who can't handle criticism. She's been here for decades, and for decades, she's poisoned the atmosphere against anyone she deemed unworthy," Charles interrupted. "I've learned things today, Camilla. Things I should have known, should have seen. Did you know she's been holding weekly traditional values meetings with junior staff? Essentially indoctrination sessions about how things were done in the old days, with not-so-subtle implications about how they should be done now." Camilla was quiet for a moment. "I knew she didn't approve of me. I didn't realize she was actively campaigning against me. Neither did I, and that's my failure as much as anyone's. I've been so focused on state duties, on the bigger picture, that I missed what was happening in my own home." Charles took her hand. "But that changes now. I've already spoken with Margaret Rhodes. You remember her? She handled the Commonwealth Youth Initiatives. I'm bringing her in as the new senior lady-in-waiting. She's modern, efficient, and, more importantly, she admires what you've been trying to do with your role." "Trying and failing, apparently," Camilla said bitterly. "No," Charles said firmly. "Trying and succeeding despite opposition that would have defeated most people. Do you know what Sergeant Mitchell told me? He said that in his 20 years of service, he's never seen someone show such strength in vulnerability. He was impressed, Camilla, not appalled." Later that afternoon, in the guards' ready room, Sergeant James Mitchell was indeed fielding questions from his colleagues about the morning's events. The room was filled with off-duty guards, all eager for details about what was already being called the morning room incident. "Come on, Mitchell," Corporal Fraser pressed. "We were all there. What really happened?" Mitchell, a man in his 40s with silver threading through his dark hair and the bearing of someone who had seen active service before joining the Royal Protection Unit, considered his words carefully. What happened, he said finally, was a reminder that the people we protect are human beings under extraordinary pressure. Her Majesty had a difficult morning. We did our job. End of story. But the screaming, another guard began. Have any of you considered what it must be like? Mitchell interrupted. To have every move scrutinized, every word analyzed, every gesture compared to someone who's been turned into a saint by death and distance? I serve in Afghanistan. I've seen people under fire. The kind of pressure Her Majesty faces might be different, but it's relentless. The room fell quiet. Mitchell was respected among the guards, known for his professionalism and his insights. The way I see it, he continued, our job isn't just to protect them from external threats. Sometimes, maybe it's to protect them from the internal ones too. The Queen needed help this morning, and we provided it. That's what we're here for. Lady Pemberton looked terrified. Corporal Fraser observed. Lady Pemberton, Mitchell said carefully, has been a source of significant stress in this household for years. Perhaps it's time for change. As evening fell over Whitmore Palace, a small convoy of cars departed from the staff entrance. Lady Margaret Pemberton sat in the back of one, her possessions following in another. She did not look back at the palace that had been her life for over 4 decades. Her face was set in rigid lines, but those who knew her well might have noticed the glimmer of tears she refused to let fall. In the family dining room, Charles and Camilla sat across from each other at a table that could seat 20, but had been set intimately for 2. Camilla had changed into a simple cashmere dress, her face washed clean of makeup, looking younger and more vulnerable than her public image ever allowed. I've been thinking, Charles said as they ate a simple meal of roasted chicken and vegetables, about what you said, about competing with a ghost. Camilla looked up from her plate, where she had been pushing food around more than eating. The truth is, Charles continued, I've allowed that ghost to haunt this palace for too long. Out of guilt, perhaps, or misplaced loyalty. But it's not fair to you, and it's not healthy for the institution. She was the mother of your children, Camilla said softly. The nation loved her. I understand why. The nation loved an image, Charles interrupted gently. A carefully crafted, media-managed image that even she found suffocating at times. You know, she used to call this place a prison. She told me once that she envied you your freedom. Camilla's eyes widened. She knew about us? Of course she knew. We were all trapped in a story none of us had written, playing parts that made everyone miserable. The difference is that when she died, she was released from that story, transformed into something she never was in life. Perfect, untouchable, beyond reproach. Well, you've had to live with being cast as the villain. I was the other woman, Camilla said quietly. In any story, that makes me the villain. You were the woman I loved when I was too young and too bound by duty to follow my heart, Charles corrected. And when we finally found our way back to each other after so much pain and time lost, I thought the hardest part was over. I was naive. They continued their meal in contemplative silence, the weight of the day's revelations settling around them like a heavy cloak. Outside, the palace continued its eternal rhythms, guards changing shifts, servants preparing for tomorrow's duties, the machinery of monarchy grinding on regardless of the human dramas within its walls. There's something else, Charles said eventually. I've had Edmund look into the household staff, particularly those hired or promoted during Lady Pemberton's sphere of influence. There are going to be more changes, I'm afraid. Nothing dramatic. I won't have a purge, but certain individuals will be offered positions in other royal residences or generous retirement packages. They'll say I'm paranoid, that I'm creating a culture of fear, Camilla predicted. They'll say what they always say, Charles replied. What matters is creating an environment where you can thrive, where your work can be appreciated for what it is rather than constantly diminished by comparison to what it isn't. As they finished dinner, Camilla's phone buzzed with a message. She glanced at it and gasped softly. What is it? Charles asked, concerned. It's from Princess Catherine, Camilla said, showing him the screen. The message was brief but warm. Heard you had a difficult day. Just wanted you to know that William and I think you're doing a wonderful job. The children adore their Gone Gone Cam. Don't let anyone tell you differently. Camilla's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of gratitude rather than pain. She didn't have to do that. No, Charles agreed, but the fact that she did shows that not everyone in this family is living in the past. Catherine understands what it's like to join this institution from the outside, to be constantly measured against an impossible standard. As they retired to their private sitting room, Charles noticed Camilla moving stiffly, the tension of the day manifesting in physical discomfort. Without asking, he guided her to the sofa and began gently massaging her shoulders. When did we stop taking care of each other? He mused as he felt the knots under his fingers. When did duty become so all-consuming that we forgot to be human? When the crown became heavier than the heads wearing it, Camilla replied, leaning back against him. They sat like that for a long while, finding comfort in each other's presence. The palace around them was settling into its nighttime routine, but within their private space, a different kind of settling was occurring, a recommitment to each other, to their partnership, to weathering whatever storms might come. I need to apologize to Sergeant Mitchell, Camilla said suddenly. I screamed at him to get out. He was only trying to help. I've already conveyed your gratitude, Charles assured her. He understood perfectly. In fact, he's been assigned to head up a review of palace security protocols, specifically regarding the welfare of the principals. He suggested, quite wisely, that perhaps security should include emotional well-being as well as physical safety. A progressive military man, Camilla observed with a small smile. Will wonders never cease? The world is changing, Charles said, even within these ancient walls. The question is whether we change with it or get left behind. The clock on the mantel chimed 11, and Camilla yawned despite herself. The emotional exhaustion of the day was catching up with her, making her eyelids heavy. Bed, Charles commanded gently. Doctor's orders, remember? Rest and reduced duties. As they prepared for bed, Camilla caught sight of herself in the mirror. Her face showed the strain of the day, the puffiness around her eyes from crying, the lines that seemed deeper than they had this morning. But there was something else there too, something that hadn't been present in a long time. Relief, perhaps, or maybe just the beginning of acceptance that she didn't have to be perfect, didn't have to compete with a ghost, didn't have to smile through the pain anymore. Charles, she called from the bathroom. Yes, darling. What if it happens again? What if I lose control like that again? Charles appeared in the doorway, already in his pajamas. Then, we'll deal with it. Together. And maybe next time, you won't have to reach a breaking point before asking for help. As they settled into bed, Charles pulled Camilla close, feeling the tension slowly leaving her body. The day had been traumatic, unprecedented in many ways, but perhaps necessary. Sometimes, he reflected, things had to break completely before they could be rebuilt stronger. I love you, he whispered into the darkness. I love you too, she replied. Even when I'm throwing priceless porcelain and terrifying elderly courtiers. Especially then, he said, and felt her smile against his chest. Outside their windows, London sprawled beneath a canopy of stars, largely invisible due to the city's light pollution. But within the palace walls, in this moment of quiet intimacy, a different kind of light was beginning to shine. The light of understanding, of acceptance, of a partnership renewed and strengthened by adversity. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There would be staff to reassure, protocols to revise, and undoubtedly, rumors to quash. The press would sniff around for any hint of scandal, and those who opposed Camilla would look for ways to use the day's events against her. But tonight, in the sanctuary of their private quarters, none of that mattered. What mattered was that the mask had finally slipped, the perfect royal facade had cracked, and instead of disaster, there had been revelation. Camilla had shown her humanity, and in doing so, had perhaps found a path to a more authentic kind of queenship, one that didn't require her to be anyone but herself. As sleep finally claimed them both, the palace continued its eternal watch, guardian of secrets and traditions of history and hope. And in the morning room, now cleaned of debris and restored to pristine order, Only the faintest crack in the plaster of one wall remained as evidence of the day when Queen Camilla's emotional explosion had changed everything. The following week at Whitmore Palace unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of change and adaptation. News of Lady Pemberton's sudden departure had rippled through the household staff like a stone dropped in still water, creating waves of speculation and, in some quarters, concern. Those who had been allied with the former senior lady-in-waiting found themselves suddenly uncertain of their positions, while others who had chafed under her rigid adherence to outdated protocols saw an opportunity for the modernization they had long hoped for. Margaret Rhodes, the newly appointed senior lady-in-waiting, arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning with an efficiency that immediately set her apart from her predecessor. A woman in her early 50s with auburn hair touched with silver and an easy smile, she had previously managed the Commonwealth Youth Initiatives with a combination of warmth and competence that had earned her widespread respect. Her first act was not to call a meeting or issue new protocols, but to spend the day walking through the palace, introducing herself to everyone from the senior butler to the newest kitchen maid. In the blue drawing room, she found herself face to face with a small group of Lady Pemberton's former allies, ladies-in-waiting and senior household staff who viewed her arrival with barely concealed suspicion. "I understand that change can be unsettling," Margaret said, addressing them with calm directness. "But I want to assure you that I'm not here to conduct a revolution. I'm here to support Her Majesty in her role and to ensure that this household runs smoothly and harmoniously. That means respecting tradition while also acknowledging that we live in the 21st century." Mrs. Clarissa Worthington, a lady-in-waiting who had been particularly close to Lady Pemberton, sniffed disdainfully. Lady Pemberton understood the importance of maintaining standards. Without proper protocols, without respect for the way things have always been done, the monarchy loses its dignity. "With respect," Margaret replied, her tone remaining pleasant but firm. "Dignity doesn't come from rigid adherence to outdated customs. It comes from grace, kindness, and the ability to connect with people. Her Majesty possesses all of these qualities in abundance, and it's our job to support her, not to judge her against standards set by those who came before." Meanwhile, Queen Camilla was discovering what it meant to have her schedule dramatically reduced on doctor's orders. For someone accustomed to days packed with engagements, charity visits, and official functions, the enforced rest was both a blessing and a challenge. She found herself in her private study, attempting to read through correspondence, when Charles appeared with 2 cups of tea. "You're supposed to be resting," he chided gently, setting the tea down and taking the letters from her hands. "I am resting," Camilla protested. "I'm sitting down, aren't I?" "Reading through 50 requests for patronage is not resting." Charles settled into the chair beside her desk. Dr. Pembroke was quite specific. "Rest means rest." Camilla sighed, accepting the tea gratefully. "I can't simply do nothing, Charles. There are people counting on me, charities that need support, causes that—" "We'll all still be there next week," Charles interrupted. "The world will not end if Queen Camilla takes a few days to recuperate. In fact, I rather think it might benefit from having you at full strength rather than running on empty." They were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Margaret Rhodes entered, carrying a tablet and wearing an expression of careful neutrality. "Your Majesties, forgive the interruption, but there's something you should be aware of." She handed the tablet to Charles. "It seems news of the household changes has reached the press." Charles scanned the article quickly, his frown deepening. The headline read, "Palace Purge. Queen Camilla cleans house after years of tension." The article was full of speculation and unnamed sources, painting a picture of a vindictive queen finally seizing power and casting out those who had dared to oppose her. "Unnamed sources," Charles said with disgust. "Let me guess, former members of staff who suddenly have opinions to share?" "I'm afraid so," Margaret confirmed. "Lady Pemberton herself has maintained silence, but some of her associates appear to have been less discreet." Camilla reached for the tablet, but Charles held it away from her. "No, this is exactly the kind of thing you don't need to be reading right now." Charles, I'm not a child. If they're writing about me, I have a right to know what they're saying. What they're saying, Margaret interjected gently, is largely nonsense based on third-hand gossip and speculation. The palace press office is already preparing a response emphasizing the routine nature of staff changes and Your Majesty's ongoing commitment to modernizing the household while respecting tradition. But Camilla had already taken the tablet from Charles's reluctant hands and was reading rapidly, her face growing paler with each paragraph. The article painted her as emotionally unstable, suggested that she had thrown a tantrum that required military intervention, and implied that loyal staff members were being purged in a fit of paranoid revenge. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said quietly, handing the tablet back. "They're using my moment of weakness to paint me as unfit, unstable, unworthy of the crown. They're using anonymous gossip to sell papers," Charles corrected firmly. "It will blow over, as these things always do." "Will it?" Camilla stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the palace gardens. "Or will this be the narrative that sticks? Mad Queen Camilla, emotional and vindictive, not fit to fill the shoes of her sainted predecessor." Margaret exchanged a glance with Charles before speaking. "Your Majesty, if I may, in my experience, the best response to this kind of speculation is to show them how wrong they are. Not through statements or denials, but through actions. Let them see the real you, the dedicated, compassionate woman who works tirelessly for her causes and her people. But not this week," Charles added firmly. "This week you rest. Next week, we can discuss a strategy for moving forward." Later that afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived at the palace. Prince William had not been scheduled for any meetings, but he appeared in Charles's office with a determined expression that reminded his father powerfully of his late mother when she had set her mind on something. "Papa," William began without preamble, "we need to talk about what's happening with Camilla." Charles set aside the state papers he had been reviewing. "I assume you've seen the press coverage." "I've seen it, and I'm furious," William said, taking a seat across from his father. "These attacks on Camilla are disgraceful. After everything she's done, everything she's endured to support you and the institution, to have her portrayed as some sort of hysterical harridan." Charles was touched by his son's vehemence. The relationship between William and Camilla had not always been easy, but over the years, they had developed a genuine affection and respect for each other. "What do you propose?" Charles asked. "A united front," William said immediately. "Catherine, and I want to increase our joint appearances with Camilla. Show the public and the press that the family stands behind her completely. The children adore her. Perhaps it's time to let that show more publicly as well." "That's kind of you, William, but I won't have Camilla turned into a PR project." "It's not PR," William interrupted. "It's family." When Catherine faced her challenges with the press, Camilla was one of her strongest supporters behind the scenes. Now it's our turn to support her. Meanwhile, in another part of the palace, Sergeant James Mitchell was conducting his review of security protocols as requested by the king. He had assembled a small team of trusted guards and was interviewing household staff about their observations and concerns. "The thing is," one young footman was saying nervously, "there's always been this atmosphere, you know? Like there were two courts, those who supported Her Majesty and those who didn't. It made everything tense, like you had to pick a side." Mitchell made notes, his expression thoughtful. "And this tension, did it affect the smooth running of the household?" "Oh yes," the footman said, growing more confident. "Sometimes orders would be contradicted, or things Her Majesty requested would be forgotten or done differently than she asked. Lady Pemberton would say it was maintaining standards, but it was undermining the Queen," Mitchell finished. The footman nodded, looking relieved that someone had said it out loud. These interviews painted a picture of a household divided, where subtle sabotage and resistance had been disguised as adherence to tradition. Mitchell began to understand that the Queen's explosion in the morning room had not been a sudden break, but the culmination of years of accumulated slights and frustrations. In the palace medical wing, Dr. Rebecca Marshall, the therapist Dr. Pembroke had recommended, was having her first session with Camilla. The Queen had initially resisted the idea, but Charles's gentle insistence and her own recognition that she needed help had finally swayed her. "I want to be clear," Dr. Marshall said, her manner professional but warm, "that everything we discuss here is completely confidential. I worked with high-profile clients for 20 years, and I've never had a breach of trust." Camilla sat stiffly in her chair, still uncomfortable with the idea of therapy. "I suppose you want me to talk about my feelings," she said with a slight edge to her voice. "I want you to talk about whatever you feel comfortable discussing," Dr. Marshall replied. "We can start wherever you like. Perhaps you could tell me what brought you here today." Camilla was quiet for a long moment. Then the words began to flow, slowly at first, then in a rush. She talked about the constant comparisons, the feeling of being an imposter in her own life, the weight of expectations she could never meet. She spoke of loving Charles, but sometimes resenting the crown that came with him, of wanting to do good work, but having it overshadowed by old scandals and gossip. "I've spent so many years trying to be perfect," she said, tears flowing freely now. "Trying to prove I deserve to be here, that I wasn't the terrible person they painted me as. And then, last week, I proved them all right, didn't I? I lost control. I acted like a madwoman. I justified every terrible thing they've ever said about me. What I hear," Dr. Marshall said gently, "is someone who's been under immense pressure for a very long time without adequate support. What happened last week wasn't madness. It was a very human response to an inhuman situation." As the session continued, Camilla found herself unburdening years of suppressed emotion. The feeling was both terrifying and liberating, like lancing a wound that had been festering for far too long. That evening, the family gathered for dinner. Charles, Camilla, William, Catherine, and their children. It was meant to be an informal affair, but the presence of the younger royals gave it a significance that everyone felt. Prince George, now a thoughtful young man growing into his future role, was particularly attentive to his step-grandmother. Gone, Cam," he said during dessert, using the affectionate nickname the children had given her. "Mummy says you've been sad. Is it because of the mean things in the newspapers?" The adults exchanged glances, but Camilla smiled at her step-grandson. "Sometimes people say unkind things, yes. But you know what? Having dinner with all of you makes me feel much better. You should tell them to stop," Princess Charlotte suggested with the straightforward logic of youth. "You're the queen. Can't you make them be nice?" "If only it were that simple," Camilla said softly. "Actually," William interjected, "Charlotte has a point. Not about making them stop. We can't control what people say, but we can control how we respond. And I think it's time we responded as a family." He outlined his idea, a series of joint engagements highlighting Camilla's charitable work, with the younger royals showing their clear support and affection for their step-grandmother. Not as a PR exercise, but as a genuine display of family unity. Catherine added her own thoughts. "The public responds to authenticity. They've seen the polished version of the royal family for so long. Maybe it's time they saw the real relationships, the genuine care we have for each other." Charles watched his family rallying around his wife with deep emotion. This was what had been missing. He realized not just public support, but private solidarity. Camilla had been carrying her burden alone for too long. Later, as they prepared for bed, Camilla told Charles about her therapy session. It was strange talking to a stranger about such personal things, but also helpful, I think. Dr. Marshall said something that struck me. She said I've been trying to compete with a ghost, but the ghost isn't Diana. It's the idealized version of what a queen should be that exists in my own mind. "Wise woman," Charles observed, helping Camilla with her necklace. "And she's right. You've set impossible standards for yourself, my darling. Standards that no real person could meet." "I wanted so badly to be accepted," Camilla admitted. "To prove that I wasn't the villain in everyone's story. But maybe that's been my mistake. Maybe I've been so focused on who I'm not that I've forgotten who I am." Charles pulled her into his arms. "And who are you?" Camilla thought for a moment. "I'm a woman who loves her husband, who cares about literacy and domestic violence prevention and the arts. I'm a grandmother who adores her grandchildren, both blood And step. I'm someone who makes mistakes, but tries to do better. I'm human. That sounds like a perfect queen to me, Charles said. Meanwhile, in the staff quarters, a quiet revolution was taking place. Margaret Rhodes had instituted what she called tea and honesty sessions, informal gatherings where staff could voice concerns and suggestions without fear of reprisal. The first session had been sparsely attended, but word had spread that the new senior lady-in-waiting genuinely listened and acted on reasonable suggestions. The thing is, Mrs. Patterson, a longtime housekeeper, was saying, "We've all seen how hard Her Majesty works. But there's been this culture of criticism, like nothing she does is quite right. It's wearing on everyone, not just her." "Then, let's change the culture," Margaret said simply. "Let's focus on supporting Her Majesty's work rather than comparing it to anyone else's. Let's celebrate successes instead of dwelling on perceived failures. Change starts with us." The ripple effects of that terrible morning in the morning room were spreading throughout the palace in unexpected ways. Guards were more attentive to the emotional state of those they protected. Staff were beginning to work as a unified team rather than rival factions. And, most importantly, Camilla was beginning to let down the wall she had built around herself. A few days later, Sergeant Mitchell requested a private audience with the Queen. Camilla received him in her study, still feeling embarrassed about their last encounter. "Sergeant Mitchell, I owe you an apology," she began, but he raised a hand respectfully. "No apology necessary, Your Majesty. I wanted to speak with you about my security review. I've identified several areas where we can better support the well-being of the royal family, not just their physical safety." He outlined his proposals: regular check-ins with a designated security liaison, better communication channels between protection officers and principals, and training for guards to recognize signs of emotional distress and respond appropriately. "You're turning bodyguards into therapists?" Camilla asked with a small smile. "Not therapists, ma'am. Just human beings looking out for other human beings. The crown may be an institution, but it's worn by people. People who sometimes need more than just protection from physical threats." Camilla was touched by his consideration. "Thank you, Sergeant. Your compassion that morning, it meant more than you know. Just doing my duty, ma'am. Though I must say, it's refreshing to serve someone who shows their humanity. Makes the job feel more worthwhile, if you understand my meaning." As the week drew to a close, Camilla found herself in the morning room for the first time since the incident. The porcelain had been replaced, the furniture restored to its proper position. Only if you looked very closely could you see the hairline crack in the plaster where something had struck the wall. Margaret Rhodes found her there, staring at that tiny imperfection. "Shall I have maintenance repair that, Your Majesty?" Margaret asked. "No," Camilla said after a moment. "Leave it. Let it be a reminder." "Of what, ma'am?" "That even the strongest walls can crack under pressure. And that sometimes that's not a sign of weakness but of humanity." That evening, the palace released a carefully worded statement addressing the recent press speculation. It spoke of the royal household's commitment to modernization while respecting tradition, of the Queen's dedication to her charitable causes, and of the family's united support for all its members. It was dignified, measured, and gave away nothing of the real drama that had unfolded. But for those within the palace walls, everything had changed. The atmosphere was lighter, more collaborative. Staff members smiled more readily, conversations flowed more freely, and there was a sense that a new chapter was beginning. Camilla stood at her bedroom window that night, looking out over London. The city sprawled before her, millions of lives unfolding in parallel to her own. Somewhere out, there were people who would always see her as the villain, who would compare her unfavorably to others, who would judge her for a past she couldn't change. But also out there were people whose lives had been touched by her charities, who had been inspired by her resilience, who saw in her a queen who understood struggle and imperfection because she had lived it. "Coming to bed?" Charles asked, and she turned to see him already under the covers, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed tomorrow's briefing papers. "In a moment," she said, taking one last look at the city. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself or fail in the attempt. The press would continue their speculation, critics would voice their opinions, and the ghost of perfection would always hover just out of reach. But tonight, she was simply Camilla, flawed, human, loved, and finally beginning to believe that might be enough. 3 months had passed since the morning room incident, and the transformation within Whitmore Palace was remarkable to those who cared to notice. The rigid atmosphere that had once pervaded the corridors had given way to something more collaborative, more human. Staff members who had previously scurried past each other with downcast eyes now exchanged greetings and genuine smiles. The palace, while maintaining its grandeur and protocols, had somehow become warmer. Queen Camilla stood before a full-length mirror in her dressing room as her dresser, Mrs. Angela Morrison, made final adjustments to her gown for the evening's state banquet. It was to be the first major ceremonial event since the household changes, and everyone was aware of its significance. "You look radiant, Your Majesty," Angela said, stepping back to admire her work. The relationship between the Queen and her dresser had evolved considerably over the past months. Where once there had been stiff formality, there was now an easy professionalism built on mutual respect. "I feel radiant," Camilla admitted, surprising herself with the truth of it. The deep burgundy gown complemented her coloring perfectly, and the Cambridge lover's knot tiara, a piece she had initially been hesitant to wear due to its associations with the past, sat comfortably on her carefully styled hair. A knock at the door preceded Charles's entrance. He stopped short at the sight of his wife, his face breaking into a warm smile. "You look magnificent," he said, crossing to take her hands. "The tiara," Camilla began, but Charles silenced her with a gentle squeeze of her fingers. "Suits you perfectly. It's a piece of royal history, and you're part of that history now. No apologies, no explanations needed." In the 3 months since her breakdown, Camilla had undergone more than just a superficial transformation. The therapy sessions with Dr. Marshall had become a regular part of her routine, providing her with tools to manage the unique pressures of her position. She had learned to recognize the early signs of overwhelming stress and to address them before they reached a breaking point. More significantly, she had stopped trying to be anyone other than herself. The result was a queen who was more authentic, more relaxed, and, paradoxically, more regal than ever before. "The President of France and his wife have arrived," Charles informed her. "William and Catherine are already in the reception room, and I believe young George is practicing his French phrases one last time." Camilla smiled at the mention of her step-grandson. The young prince had specifically requested to be included in the formal greeting party, eager to use the French he had been studying. It was exactly the kind of family touch that would have been discouraged under the old regime, but was now embraced as part of the monarchy's more personal approach. As they made their way to the reception, Camilla noticed Sergeant Mitchell standing at his post near the staterooms. He gave her a subtle nod of acknowledgement, which she returned with a slight smile. The new security protocols he had implemented had made a remarkable difference. The guards were still utterly professional, but there was now an understanding that their role extended beyond mere physical protection. The reception room buzzed with controlled energy as dignitaries mingled before the formal dinner. Camilla moved through the crowd with a grace that no longer felt forced or performed. She genuinely enjoyed these occasions now, freed from the constant self-criticism that had once plagued her every interaction. "Your Majesty," the French president's wife, Madame du Bois, greeted her warmly. "I must tell you how much I admire your work with literacy programs. The initiative you launched last month, connecting rural schools with authors, it's exactly the kind of practical support education needs." Camilla felt the familiar warm glow that came from discussing her charitable work. This was where she truly shined, when she could speak passionately about causes close to her heart without worrying about comparisons or criticisms. "Thank you, Madame du Bois. I believe every child deserves access to the magic of books. We're hoping to expand the program internationally next year. Perhaps we could discuss a collaboration with French schools." As they talked, Camilla was aware of Margaret Rhodes smoothly managing the logistics of the evening in the background. The new senior lady-in-waiting had proven invaluable, not just in her efficiency, but in her ability to anticipate and prevent the small friction points that had once made such events stressful. The dinner itself was a triumph. Prince George, given the honor of offering the first toast in French, delivered his brief speech with only minor stumbling over the pronunciation. When he looked to Camilla for reassurance, she gave him an encouraging wink that helped him through the final phrases. "Magnifique!" President Du Bois exclaimed, leading the applause. "Such confidence in one so young. You must be very proud, Your Majesties." "Incredibly proud," Charles agreed, while Camilla beamed at her step-grandson, who was pink with pleasure and relief. The evening progressed smoothly, with conversation flowing as freely as the wine. At one point, Catherine leaned over to Camilla during a lull between courses. "You seem so comfortable now," she observed quietly. "Like you've finally found your rhythm." Camilla considered this. "I think I've finally stopped trying to dance to someone else's music," she replied. "It's amazing how much easier it is when you're moving to your own beat." Catherine squeezed her hand under the table, a gesture of support that would have been unthinkable under the strict protocols of the past. These small moments of genuine connection had become more common as the family had rallied around Camilla following the crisis. After dinner, as the guests moved to the blue drawing room for coffee and liqueurs, Camilla found herself in conversation with Sir Edmund Hartley. The king's private secretary had been a witness to her lowest moment, but his demeanor toward her had never wavered in its respectfulness. "If I may say so, Your Majesty," he ventured carefully, "the household feels quite transformed. There's an energy now, a sense of purpose that was perhaps lacking before." "Change is never easy, Sir Edmund," Camilla replied. "But sometimes it's necessary. I've learned that trying to preserve something that isn't working helps no one." "Indeed, ma'am. And if I might add, the staff speak very highly of the new atmosphere. Productivity is up, morale is significantly improved, and the number of sick days has dropped remarkably." This was news to Camilla, and welcome news at that. "Really? Oh yes. It seems that when people feel valued and supported rather than constantly judged, they perform better. Revolutionary concept, I know," he added with a dry smile that made Camilla laugh. As the evening wound down and the guests began to depart, Camilla found herself back in her dressing room, Angela helping her out of the formal gown, and Jules. The tiara was carefully placed back in its velvet case, ready to be returned to the vault. "How did it feel, ma'am?" Angela asked as she hung the gown. "Wearing the Cambridge tiara?" Camilla considered the question. "Like wearing a beautiful piece of jewelry," she said finally. "Nothing more, nothing less. It's just a tiara, isn't it? Metal and stones. The weight it carries is only what we give it." Angela smiled. "That's a healthy way to look at it, if I may say so." Later, in their private sitting room, Charles and Camilla conducted their usual post-event debrief over nightcaps. It was a ritual they had developed over the years, a chance to unwind and share observations about the evening. "President Du Bois seemed quite taken with your literacy initiative," Charles observed. "I think you may have secured a valuable partnership there." "I hope so." Madame Du Bois was genuinely interested, not just being polite. She even offered to connect me with some French authors who might be willing to participate. Charles raised his glass. "To my wife, the diplomat, who knew that being authentic would be such an effective negotiation tactic." Camilla clinked her glass against his. "To my husband, who stood by me when authenticity looked remarkably like a nervous breakdown." They sipped their drinks in comfortable silence for a moment before Charles spoke again. "I had an interesting conversation with William tonight. He's been so impressed by the changes here that he's thinking of implementing similar reforms in his own household. Less rigid hierarchy, more focus on well-being." "The younger generation gets it," Camilla said. "They understand that the institution has to evolve to survive. We can't keep operating like it's 1952. "No," Charles agreed, "though I suspect there are still those who wish we could." This was true. Not everyone had embraced the changes. A small contingent of traditionalists, both within the palace and in the wider establishment, grumbled about declining standards and the loss of proper protocol. But Their voices were increasingly drowned out by the evident success of the new approach. A week later, Camilla sat in Dr. Marshall's office for her regular session. The therapist had become a trusted confidant, someone with whom Camilla could be completely honest without fear of judgment or breach of confidence. "How are you feeling about the media coverage of the state dinner?" Dr. Marshall asked. The press had been overwhelmingly positive, praising the Queen's warmth and the evident family unity on display. Surprisingly calm, Camilla admitted. There was one piece that mentioned how much more relaxed I seemed compared to previous events, and instead of analyzing what they meant or worrying about the subtext, I just thought, yes, I was more relaxed. "Good. That's significant progress," Dr. Marshall observed. "You're no longer filtering everything through the lens of criticism." "I think I've finally accepted that there will always be critics," Camilla said. "Some people will never forgive me for my past, will never see me as legitimate. And that's okay. It has to be okay because I can't change their minds, and destroying myself trying is pointless." They discussed the various coping strategies Camilla had developed: regular exercise, mindfulness practices, and, most importantly, open communication with Charles and her support network when she felt overwhelmed. "What about Lady Pemberton?" Dr. Marshall asked. "Any word of her since she left?" Camilla's expression grew thoughtful. "She's retired to a cottage in the Cotswolds, I believe. Part of me feels guilty about how things ended, but I've come to realize that her presence was toxic, not just for me, but for the entire household. Sometimes, removing a negative influence is the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved, including the person themselves." Meanwhile, in the staff quarters, Margaret Rhodes was hosting one of her regular tea sessions. These had evolved from tentative gatherings into vibrant discussions where staff felt empowered to share ideas and concerns. "I've been thinking," Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper, said. "What if we created a mentorship program? Pair experienced staff with newcomers, help them navigate palace life without all the factional politics we used to have." "Excellent idea," Margaret said, making notes. "Would you be willing to head that up, Mrs. Patterson?" The housekeeper beamed. "I'd be honored." These sessions had yielded numerous improvements, from practical scheduling changes to more significant cultural shifts. The palace was becoming a place where people wanted to work, rather than an intimidating institution where survival meant choosing sides. In his office, Sergeant Mitchell was reviewing the quarterly security report with satisfaction. The new protocols had not only improved the emotional well-being of the royal family, but had actually enhanced security overall. Guards who were more engaged and aware of subtleties were better able to identify potential threats. He was interrupted by a knock. Corporal Fraser entered, looking pleased. "The young princes and princess have requested self-defense lessons," Fraser reported. "Prince William supports it, and wanted to know if you'd be willing to oversee the program personally." Mitchell smiled. This was another positive change, the younger royals being allowed to develop practical skills rather than being wrapped in cotton wool. "I'd be happy to," he said. "Set up a schedule. And Fraser? Make sure Princess Charlotte gets the same training as her brothers. No gender distinctions in self-defense." "Already planned for it, sir," Fraser grinned. As autumn deepened into winter, the transformation that had begun with a moment of crisis had solidified into a new normal. The palace ran more smoothly than it had in years. Charitable initiatives flourished under the Queen's more confident leadership, and the family presented a genuinely united front that resonated with the public. Camilla stood in the morning room one gray November afternoon, looking at the spot where she had lost control all those months ago. The crack in the plaster had been left unrepaired at her request, a thin line barely visible unless you knew where to look. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Charles said, joining her. "I was thinking about how that was simultaneously the worst and best day of my life," Camilla mused. "The worst because I felt so completely broken. The best because it was the beginning of putting myself back together properly." Charles wrapped an arm around her waist. "You know what I see when I look at that crack?" "What?" "Proof that even the strongest structures need maintenance. That ignoring problems doesn't make them go away. And that sometimes a little damage can let the light in." Camilla leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. Outside, the palace gardens were brown with approaching winter, but inside, there was warmth and light and the quiet hum of an institution that had found its rhythm. "We have the children coming for dinner tonight," Charles reminded her. "George wants to show you his history project, something about medieval queens." "I hope he hasn't chosen any who lost their heads," Camilla said wryly. "Actually, I believe he's focusing on Eleanor of Aquitaine. Says she reminds him of someone he knows, a strong woman who redefined queenship on her own terms." Camilla felt tears prick her eyes. "That boy will make a wonderful king someday." With excellent examples to learn from, Charles agreed, including a step-grandmother who showed him that strength sometimes means admitting when you need help. As they left the morning room, Camilla glanced back one more time at the tiny crack in the wall. It would always be there, a permanent reminder of a moment when everything had seemed to fall apart. But like the Japanese art of kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with gold, making it more beautiful for having been broken, the palace and its inhabitants had been transformed by that moment of shattering. The state banquet had been a public triumph, but the real victory was in the daily life of the palace, in the genuine smiles of staff, the easy affection of family, the confidence with which Camilla now inhabited her role. She had stopped trying to be a perfect queen and had instead become something far more valuable, a human one. As evening fell and the palace prepared for another family dinner, informal, warm, filled with the chatter of children and the laughter of adults who genuinely enjoyed each other's company, Camilla felt a profound sense of gratitude, not for the crown or the title or the palaces, but for the journey that had brought her here, cracks and all. The guard who had once intervened in a moment of crisis now smiled and nodded as she passed. The staff who had once been divided now worked in harmony. The family who had once been strained by unspoken tensions now gathered in genuine unity. And at the center of it all, a queen who had learned that the heaviest crown was the one you fashioned from your own impossible expectations, and that setting it down was not a sign of weakness, but the ultimate act of strength. As Camilla took her place at the dinner table, surrounded by the cheerful chaos of family life, she felt the truth of what she had discovered. That being enough wasn't about being perfect. It was about being present, being genuine, and being willing to show both your strength and your vulnerability. The palace walls still stood strong around them, but within those walls, something far more precious had been built. A home where humanity was valued above protocol, where support mattered more than tradition, and where a queen could finally, truly, just be herself. The transformation was complete, not because Camilla had become someone different, but because she had finally become who she had always been underneath the weight of expectation. And in that becoming, she had not only saved herself, but had shown others that there was more than one way to wear a crown. With grace, certainly, but also with the kind of authentic humanity that connects hearts across all barriers of rank and privilege. The palace settled into its evening routines, guards at their posts, staff preparing for tomorrow's duties, and a family sharing a meal like any other, except that this family happened to wear crowns, and their home happened to be a palace, and their story, with all its cracks and repairs, was still being written one authentic day at a time.